Did you know some people hate certain flies? In fact, they hate them so much, they'll call them junk flies or trash flies. But here's what's funny about that. Usually, we dislike flies because they don't work for us. But these trash flies flat out produce. They're crazy effective. In fact, I've got most of these trash flies in my fly box right now, and you should too. On today's episode of Untangled, I'll talk about what trash flies are and why some people hate them so much. We'll also go over what these flies imitate and when and how you should use them. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled and I am your host, Spencer Durant. Years ago, I was reading this old fly tying book, and this book was published in the 70s, I believe, and I wasn't reading it in the 70s. I should probably make that clear. I'm not that old, okay? But I remember getting to one point in this book where the author, and I don't remember who wrote it, but this quote has stuck in my mind for a long time. But the author says something to the effect of a good fly is tied with natural materials only. Kind of a weird thing to say, but he said it. Then not too long ago, maybe, 4 or 5, 6 years ago, I was in a fly shop and I was shooting the bull with some of the folks in there. As you do, you go to a fly shop, just get to chatting. And I brought up to the guys, we were talking about how the river nearby was fishing. And I said that the squirmy worm had been producing for me on the river and I'd caught quite a few fish on it. And one of the anglers who was in the shop, he pipes up and goes, "Well, that's not a real fly. You might as well be bait fishing." And I just kind of looked at him and gave him a little sidewise look and just continued on talking, but that stuck in my mind as well. And then most recently, I was on a trip to Montana a few years ago with a buddy of mine, and we stopped on the way up to fish the Henry's Fork, as one will do. If you're going to drive by the Henry's Fork, yeah, even though it's not my favorite place to fish, sometimes you gotta just wet a line in it. Well, we stopped right where the river comes out of Henry's Lake, and my buddy caught a 24-inch rainbow on a mop fly. He was Euro nymphing too. He was really just breaking every rule at the Henry's Fork. But then he hands me his rod with that same fly, and I caught a 22-inch cut bow out of the same hole, again, on that same mop fly, which was a pretty cool experience. Well, later on in that trip, we were at a fly shop, I think, and we were telling somebody about, we caught a couple of nice fish out of the Henrys. We were right below the lake. And the person we were telling the story to responded with, "Well, you caught it on a mop fly, so that doesn't count." Now, I want to ask you a question. Why would so many anglers over so many years and in so many different places have this idea, have this conception in mind that there are only certain flies that are real flies? What's that all about? Well, there's this upper crust of folks in fly fishing who think that this sport is some sort of very dignified affair where everything is prim, proper, and polished, and if so much as a 1/4 inch of grass on the mown riverbank dares to be out of order, it renders the whole experience null and void. Ergo, you've got to fish with flies made from only real materials, fur and feathers, or you might as well just admit defeat and fish with bait instead, because bait is at least more dignified than trash flies. That way of thinking is out there, and obviously I disagree with it. I disagree with it immensely because it's just not true. It's not conducive to the growth mindset that I think you need to have if you want to become a good angler. And it's just kind of silly to get all worked up over whether or not a fly is a real fly or not. It's odd. It's odd to me, but you will still run into this attitude out there in the fly fishing world, especially in some of the forums and whatnot. And I think for beginners, it can be incredibly confusing because you hear about flies, you hear about these great patterns, you hear about your confidence flies, your must-have flies, and you get excited. And then someone says something somewhere about, that's just a trash fly. And it really can throw the beginner for a loop because well, what's a trash fly? What the heck is it? Well, you've probably heard that term before. And if you haven't, well, welcome to it. You're hearing the term. But there's really not a true definition of trash flies. So I want to try and define them here. And you also might have heard them called junk flies. It's the same thing. But basically, we're talking about this. It's any fly that's tied with a synthetic material that falls a little bit outside the norm of what we've come to accept in fly fishing as your standard flies. Even though paragons, for example, they're tied with all of that resin and you cure it with a UV light. At the very least, they still have a thread body. They've still got wire. They've still got a Coque de Leon tail, usually, maybe some other fibers. Maybe they have a dubbing collar on them. So even though it's a very futuristic style fly and it's using a lot of non-natural materials like UV resin, there's still enough nature to it that some folks don't get as worked up over the paragons as they do over the squirmy worm. Now, examples of your trash flies would be your squirmy worms, your mop flies, and then your egg flies. That's where those are the ones you're most commonly going to hear referred to as trash flies. You could also include pellet flies in this list, and a pellet fly is tied to look just like the pellets that fish eat in hatcheries. They're very effective on hatchery trout right after they are dumped off of the hatchery truck. So just a little tip there. But generally, we classify something as a trash fly because it doesn't strictly imitate an aquatic insect, or it's tied from a material that you don't use in other flies, or that's just not used in fly tying very much at all. Take the squirmy worm, for example. The squirmy actually got banned by the Czech Fly Fishing Union, and it was banned from use in some international competitions. I'm not sure about all of them. I couldn't find anything definitive online when I was researching this episode, but the Czech Fly Fishing Union banned them after an American team used the squirmies to win a competition. So a lot of the controversy behind the squirmy feels a little hypocritical, maybe a little contrived, a little petty. But the squirmy worm is tied using, if you've never seen one before, it's a worm pattern, as the name implies, but it's a very floppy worm pattern. The San Juan worms, they're a little stiffer. They're tied with that chenille, and we'll get into what that is in just a second. But it's tied using this soft plastic material that's very similar to the soft plastic baits that you use on some conventional gear and conventional fishing. So some folks point to that material used to tie the squirmy and say that it crosses the line. It's no longer a fly, it's a lure, and you're just fishing a lure on the end of your fly rod. So that's one case folks will make against the squirmy. Now, the mop fly, this gets called a trash fly a lot as well, which is interesting to me because it's tied using chenille, which is just thin yarn. That's all chenille is. Granted, the chenille that you use to make a mop fly is taken literally from a mop, and it's thicker than a lot of the chenille we use in other flies. But again, we use chenille in a ton of different flies, like woolly buggers, green weenies, Pat's rubber legs, a whole host of flies use chenille. And we don't have issues with that. Last I checked, the Pat's rubber legs is a revered stonefly pattern. Woolly buggers. Let's talk about that for a minute. That fly very well might be the one that's caught more fish than any other fly in existence, and it uses chenille. So why are we getting so uptight about the mop fly just because we used a little bit of material from a mop to tie this fly? The San Juan worm is completely chenille, and it's not controversial. You might, and I'm guilty of this. Sometimes I'll give Alex a hard time for fishing the worm because, you can't hack it with flies. You've got to tie a worm on. That's tongue in cheek. That's kidding around. It makes a ton of sense to use a worm imitation because that's a naturally occurring food source available to fish in rivers. So yeah, I might be poking fun and having a little fun with it, but there's not really any controversy over using the San Juan, but there is over using the mop, even though they're both made from literally the same material. So it really is interesting how worked up folks can get about it. Now, another side of this argument, though, is that both the mop fly and the squirmy worm don't strictly imitate that aquatic insect, because the mop could be used to imitate a half dozen different bugs. It could look like a cranefly nymph or a caddis larva. Those are two very common bugs that the mop is usually said to look like. Cranefly nymphs are long. They look a lot like worms, and caddis larvae are also long and worm-like. So the mop it has this very worm-like appearance to it, and it often looks a lot like those, but it doesn't strictly imitate one or the other. It can pass as both. The Utah killer bug is a cranefly nymph example that very similar in appearance to a mop, but it doesn't get near the hate as the mop does. In fact, I haven't seen anybody complain about the Utah killer bug, but I see people complain about the mop. Go figure. Now, squirmy worms, they're much larger in diameter than the typical aquatic worms that you will find in the river, and they're a little bit closer in size to standard earthworms, which they do make it into the river at times, especially during rain. So a squirmy is a great fly to use when it's raining or right after a rainstorm. That would be a great time to have a squirmy on. So the squirmy doesn't really imitate anything in particular. It's just got a lot of attractive qualities to it. And then the pellet fly, again, they're designed to look just like the pellets that trout eat while they're in the hatcheries. So they're not imitating any sort of aquatic insect at all. They are just trying to trigger that response from hatchery fish when they see it. Oh, that's food. And then they go and snack on it. Now, I'm also not sure why eggs get lumped into the trash fly category here either, because yeah, eggs aren't an aquatic insect. I get it, but they're a naturally occurring food source. They're in the river because they come out of the fish and other fish eat them. I don't understand why some people look down on fishing with eggs. I think it's very unfair to put eggs in this category. And again, just for the record, I don't consider anything a trash fly. If you're casting a fly line and you are using some sort of fly, in my opinion, you're fly fishing. You have to be using some kind of fly. You've got to make a fly cast. You've got to cast fly line. That constitutes fly fishing in my book. Now, again, does my book matter? No, but that's what I consider fly fishing. I'm not going to look down on anybody else who does it different. I mean, shoot, I knew this guy once who used to throw Panther Martin lures on the end of his fly rod, which was hilarious, and ouch, that would hurt if you hit your head with it. I definitely wouldn't consider that fly fishing, but it was effective for the guy. He got out, he went fishing, and just because I wouldn't consider it fly fishing doesn't take away from the enjoyment that he had. It's just not, I wouldn't look at that activity and say, oh yeah, that's fly fishing. It's just fishing. But again, it doesn't matter. We love to categorize things and put everything in life in these neat little boxes. And we don't really need to. A lot of the times, it's this weird human need we have, and it causes a lot of unnecessary strife and division. But that's a whole other, this ain't a psychology podcast. So I'll take off my Professor Durant cap and get back into the fishing side of things. So that's what trash flies are. We know what they look like and what they're doing, a little bit of what they're supposed to imitate, but when would you actually use these flies? When's a good time? I mentioned to open the show that I've got all these flies in my box, and the only one that I don't have would be pellet flies, and then I think I'm all out of mop flies. I don't use mop flies very often. There's nothing against them. I end up going to a squirmy worm or an egg, and I just haven't been in that situation where I felt like I needed the mop. Probably because I tie those Utah killer bugs. That's one of my favorite cranefly nymph patterns. It's incredibly simple, super easy. It's a little bit easier than a mop fly, to be completely honest. So I tie those up. But anyways, let's look at when you should actually use each of these trash flies and some use cases for them. And I want to start with eggs. And so eggs aren't available year round, so you shouldn't be fishing them year round. The fish won't take them in the middle of August, for example. I like to use eggs from late October until runoff starts in the spring, because within that time frame, you've got your brook and your brown trout spawning. you've got whitefish spawning, and then you've also got rainbow trout spawning. That means there's going to be a ton of eggs in the water. And if you've ever seen anything about fish spawning, they dig these little nests. It's a shallow bowl in the bottom of the river. It's called a redde. And they'll deposit their eggs in the redde, and then the males will come in and fertilize those eggs. But sometimes not all the eggs make it into the redde. Sometimes they get kicked up and they drift downstream. And then the fish that aren't spawning, they're chomping on that because that's just pure protein. They're happy. They're little gym rat fish, and they want to build up as much as they can. They're going to eat that egg because it is a pure protein source. So they're very handy to have when they're spawning fish in the river. Now, a note on spawning fish, you should never target actively spawning fish. So if they're on their redds and you can actively see them spawning, don't fish for them. Just let them do their thing so that they can create more fish for us to catch in the following years. What I do, what Alex does, what we talk and preach here at VFC is that it's perfectly fine to go fish when fish are spawning. Just don't fish to those spawners. Look where you're walking so you don't walk through the redds, and fish the areas around the redds. Because, for example, if it's October and your brown trout are spawning, you've also got rainbow trout in this river, you can find the pools and the runs where there aren't any redds, and the rainbows will be stacked up in those areas looking for eggs just ready to chomp down on them. And so that's how you can ethically fish the spawn, ethically fish the egg patterns, not disrupt what the spawning fish are doing, but then still have some fun and still capitalize on eggs being a prime food source. So that's when you'd fish them. Let's look at pellet flies for a minute. Pellet flies, again, they're used for trout that just got dumped off the hatchery truck. So they will be most effective if you know the stocking schedule for your local fishery. And if you fish for stock trout, there's nothing wrong with stock trout. After, it can be pretty quick, but usually after a couple of weeks, stock trout will acclimate very quickly to the natural river environment and they'll start eating bugs. That doesn't mean they won't take a pellet fly, but within the first day or two after they've been stocked, a pellet fly can be very deadly. So that's when you'd want to have those on hand. Mop flies. Let's talk about those for a minute. Mop flies are fantastic during high water because they've got a lot of mass to them. They're tied from that thick piece of the mop, and they move a lot. So they cut a really good silhouette in the water. And we learned a few episodes ago in the show about how trout see and what to do about it. I'll link that in the show notes if you haven't listened to that one yet. But we learned about how much silhouette and shape matter to fish. And the mop fly creates just a beautiful silhouette in the water. A lot of mop flies are tied with a large bead on them and some extra lead to help them sink because that mop material can be fairly buoyant. So they can be a great point fly in like a Euro rig, for example, or a great bottom fly in a standard nymph rig as well. You can fish mop flies year round. I know a few anglers here who do. They'll fish through a hole with their regular flies, and then they'll go back through it with a mop fly and catch anything that didn't want the mayflies or the caddis, for example. But mop flies will really shine in high water situations, like right after runoff. That's when they're really going to be effective for you. And let's talk about the squirmy worm, because that's really the fly that started all this grief, I think. That's the one that we hear the most grief about. You can honestly fish with a squirmy worm year round and do just fine, but they're the best for me when I'm fishing them from late fall all the way until after runoff subsides. So that colder part of the year, they really, I can't stress that enough. They really stand out during the wintertime for me. The last couple of trips that I've been on, I mean, it has been so cold here. It was 15 below this morning when I got up. We just got a new puppy and he's adorable. We got another little papillon. We have 2 papillons now. And I took him out to go to the bathroom at 4:30 this morning. It was 15 below. And I haven't been on the river hardly at all because it's been that cold this whole time. So I'm getting a little stir crazy. I'm getting cabin fever. But anyways, the few times that I've been out on the water in the winter this year, the Squirmy saved my absolute bacon, and I love them. They are so stinking good. And you can actually see, you can get a good example of just how well Squirmies work in our latest fly selection masterclass video, which just dropped, I think this past Sunday. And I'll link that video in the show notes as well, so you can take a look at it. But then once the water starts to get high during runoff in the spring, the Squirmy will still produce. Again, I'm a much bigger fan of the Squirmy than I used to be. I can't overstate how well it works, especially during the winter. Now, what's really great about all these trash flies, we know what they are, when to fish them, but you might be thinking, all right, well, how do I fish them? Is there any special technique? No, there's not. They are so simple. Throw them on a nymph rig, throw them if you Euro nymph, if you do some sort of mono tight line rig, if you like to nymph under a bobber, throw them on and you are in business. Mop flies, you can use them in still water. I've heard of folks who will throw them out and do a very slow retrieve with them in still water, and they've had some success there. I've never used a mop fly that way, but when you think about that mop fly, it could cut the silhouette of a leech as well in the water. So that might be why they could work in still water. But that's really all you need to know about how to fish them. You just tie them onto your nymph rigs and you are good to go. During the winter, so during this time of year, I will almost always have an egg on my rig. So I'm always fishing trash during the winter. They're just too good to leave in the box. They really are. And lately I've been an eggs and bacon guy. I've been an egg with a squirmy worm together. And that might cause the dry fly purist tweed pipe wearing crowd to clutch their pearls. And I can't believe this man on his platform is preaching the evils of the trash flies. He's ruining the bloodlines of the sport. How dare he? Well, I'm sure those folks are out there, and I'm sure we'll get a mean comment or two, but yeah, this is YouTube. You kind of expect it, right? But other than those two flies, though, my egg and my squirmy, I really don't default to trash flies too much. And I call them trash flies just because it's fun. I'm not knocking the flies. Again, just want to make sure that folks know I'm not knocking them. The reason I don't default to trash flies, it's not because I dislike them at all. It's just they're my go-to winter rig, but once the seasons change, I really focus a lot on my stoneflies and my mayflies and my midges and my caddis. They produce so well for me on my local rivers that it's hard to get me to fish anything else. So I'm sure Squirmy would work in the middle of July on my favorite creek here, but I've got it dialed with a few other things, and I don't like to change too much. So I just fish what I enjoy, and that's really what you should focus on as well. Now, trash flies are nice because if you get into a situation where you are unsure of what fly to put on, if you don't really see a whole lot of bug activity, like in the winter, then put a trash fly on, right? And if you're unsure of whether you should use a trash fly in that situation, just remember what it is that you are trying to do with fly fishing. We've talked about this before, and I know you know it. So y'all can say it with me. I'll wait for a section. Get ready. You got to put flies in front of fish and make them look real. That's our job as fly anglers. That's what we do. So your fly choice is informed by what food sources you're trying to imitate. So again, if there's nothing obvious going on, no hatches, maybe you're in the doldrums of late summer when the hatches have really slowed down and the fish are full and the water's a little warm, or maybe you're in the early spring and the fish are still just starting to wake up, picking a trash fly could be a great move during that time of year because that mop or that squirmy can work as an attractor pattern. Now, attractor patterns, for those who may not know, they're just flies that are tied to get a fish's attention through size, movement, and color, right? They're designed to make the fish go, "Home. Would you look at that squirmy?" That's what they're designed to make the fish do. Examples of stimulator or of attractor flies would be the elk hair stimulator, a rainbow warrior, the royal wolf. They don't really imitate any particular insect, but they look buggy. They're great, again, if there's no obvious hatch going on, or even if you're just fishing the lull between the morning and the evening hatches. And I think, honestly, it's probably more accurate if we refer to trash flies as attractor patterns than trash flies, because that's really what they're doing. They're just trying to grab a fish's attention. So bottom line is this. Trash flies are just another tool in your toolbox. You can think of them like attractor patterns and then use them when you're prospecting, when you are trying to figure out where it is the fish are holding. If it's not immediately obvious where they're at, you're kind of, I don't know where they're at, Durant, help me out. Then, or if you're trying to determine where in the water column the fish are, trash flies can be great to help you dial that in. And remember, we've talked about this a bunch. I know you know it, but it bears repeating because the fly fishing world really makes us think that there are rules, that there is a certain set way to do things and that you have to do it that way. But there are no rules in fly fishing other than you've got to do whatever you can to put flies in front of fish and make them look real. Other than that, do what you want to accomplish that goal, including using a mop fly. And with that, folks, thanks for listening to this part of the show. I appreciate it so much. And if you have any questions about anything I tackled in this section of the show, please leave a comment. I'd love to chat with you about it. But don't go anywhere because we've got the Q&A section of the show coming right up.
Anglers are always asking, what bugs are hatching right now? And that's why we put together a year-round hatch chart. It outlines all the major bug hatches so you always know what fly to tie on, no matter where you're fishing or what time of the year. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this free hatch chart. All right, back to the show.
Every week, we spend half the show directly answering questions from viewers and listeners just like yourself. So if you've got a question about fly fishing that you would like answered, go ahead and send those in to us via the link in the show notes. And often, the questions that y'all send in become the basis for the open of the show as well. And this week's first question comes to us. Steve from Idaho writes in and says, as a beginner, is it best to concentrate on fishing the same stretch of water as I improve my casting, presentation, water reading, and so on? Or would you suggest varying the locations right away? Yes, probably overanalyzing. Great podcast. I'm about 75% of the way through the history and catch new episodes as soon as they're out. Steve, this is a great question. I like the way you're thinking about it. You might be overanalyzing a tiny bit, but that's a good thing to have in this sport. So, growing up, I fished 3 pieces of water religiously. There was the family spring creek, which we didn't own it. We're not rich, but it flowed through a town that my 5th grade grandfather settled when he came to Utah in 1847. So we always referred to it as the family spring creek, because even though other people own the land, it was just kind of cool to say, oh yeah, my 5th grade grandfather probably fished it, even though I have no idea if he did or not. But I would fish there. And then there was a high mountain creek right by my house that before I got a driver's license, I could ride my bike to. And if you've ever ridden a bike carrying a fly rod, that's a fully strung up fly rod, because you think, well, I don't want to haul the tube with me. That's so much extra weight. Of course, that's 14-year-old boy logic there for you. Don't do it. Don't ride the bike with the strung up fly rod. You're going to break it. And then you got to explain to your dad what happened. And then it's just a whole spiral. And it ain't good. It's not a good place to be. But anyways, that high mountain creek, I fished the absolute snot out of it because I never saw anybody else there. And then lastly, there was this little freestone that was about a half hour away that I could drive to once I got my license. So those are the 3 rivers I spent time on, and I knew those rivers inside and out. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that I probably knew that high mountain creek especially better than anybody else, because again, I never saw anybody there. And the family spring creek didn't get fished much, and that freestone, it got fished a lot, but I wouldn't say I was an expert there. And I'm not I'm not trying to tout myself as somebody who knew a lot. I just spent a lot of time fishing, and I really knew where the fish would be. And that little high mountain to Spring Creek, it was, oh my gosh, I love that. I need to go back there. I want to go film a video there. Maybe I'll talk Alex into that this summer. But the fish there were just really small, and the fishing was tough because there were a lot of overhanging branches, but it was an absolute blast. So that's what I grew up on, small water. So the first time that I went to the Lower Provo, which it's a small-ish river in the grand scheme of things, but it's very large compared to what I grew up with. I remember feeling just completely overwhelmed. Like I served a mission for the LDS church in New York City. And they took a kid from a small ranch town in Utah and put him in New York City. And I remember when I got there, I freaked out. I could not believe I was just so overwhelmed at New York City. I'd never been there before. I'd been to LA, I'd been to Dallas before, but New York's a whole different beast. And that's that same feeling of overwhelmed of a fish out of water that I felt in New York City. I felt the first time I got to the Lower Provo. I had no clue where to cast. I had no clue what flies to use. I was just completely lost. So if you put me on a small creek, though, I would have felt at home instantly. I would have felt a lot more confident at picking out water and knowing where the fish would be. And I'm sure you have that same sort of comfort level, especially as a beginner, I would imagine. Now, these days, I'm years removed from those particular growing experiences. I'm still going through my own. And the waters that make me scratch my head these days that they make me go back to the very basics of reading water are the long, almost featureless runs that you see on big rivers like the Bighorn in Montana or the Gray Reef section of the North Platte, where the holding water is not very obvious, and you really got to look and figure that out. And again, that's not to brag. That's not to say, oh, well, it's only the big rivers that really trip me up. No. I'm comfortable on so much water now because I've fished so many different rivers, and I'm still not completely comfortable on every piece of water either. There's always a learning curve with a new river. But I tell all these stories and share them because I think that the more you can get out and experience reading water in a variety of different conditions, I think the quicker you are going to learn what the seams look like, what the pockets look like, what a good run is versus a bad run, how to tell undercut banks, and just develop that fishy sense where the best anglers I know, they have, it's an intuition where they can just tell that there's going to be a fish there, and then they make the cast, and usually they're right. And I think some of that might be innate. It might be buried way back in that lizard brain part where it's a survival thing and whatnot. But I also think a lot of it's developed from repeat exposure to these instances. And the more variety you get, I think that's going to greatly help you as an angler. So that would be my advice. Spend time on the stuff that you know, get familiar with it, hone your skills there, but visit as much different water as you can. I think that will help make you just the most well-rounded angler you can possibly be. So thank you for that question. I really appreciate it. John from Colorado has our next question, writes in and says, can you do a segment that goes over the pros and cons of tippet rings? Oh boy, I'm going to be completely honest here. I do not understand the fascination around tippet rings because I think we get half dozen questions about tippet rings every month, literally every month. In fact, I've almost done an entire podcast episode just on tippet rings, just so I can have that topic behind me. But there's not enough to do a whole episode about because they're just a metal ring. There's not that much to them. So for those who don't know, tippet rings, they are just tiny, super easy to lose. You will lose half to 75% of every tippet ring you buy. I'm convinced of that. It's a great product, though, because you got to consistently buy more of them. So that's a good idea, I guess. But anyways, little metal rings that you tie onto the end of your leader. And once you have that ring tied on, you can tie on more pieces of tippet, hence the name tippet ring. A lot of folks really enjoy their tippet rings for their nymph rigs because you can tie one short piece of tippet off of it, and that could be the top nymph in a 2-nymph rig, and then a longer piece for your bottom nymph. So you could go like a 6-inch piece and then an 18-inch piece, and you can control the depth at which those are drifting. They'll always be 12 inches apart, and then you just move your indicator to adjust the depth of that entire rig. And that way, when you do want to change your nymphs, when it comes time to do that, it's a lot easier to just cut a nymph off one piece of tippet than it is to replace the entire rig like you would if you were fishing a tandem nymph setup. And it's also a lot easier to rig this up than tying the tags off of a surgeon's knot. And I don't know that it's stronger, but I would think a tippet ring is stronger than the surgeon's knot. That's just my gut. I don't have anything to back that up with, though. I also know there are some folks who like to use tippet rings at the end of their dry fly leaders, and they'll tie on long chunks of tippet in smaller sizes off of that ring. So their leader might be 4X, let's say, and they'll tie 24 inches of 6X tippet off of that tippet ring, and they'll tie their dry fly to that so they can make that abrupt change. They can quickly go down and switch sizes out. I don't like that for myself because I don't like adding anything else to a dry fly rig. I want the dry fly. If I'm doing a double dry fly rig, that's all I want. I want to reduce the possibility of spooking fish and drag as much as possible. That's why I don't use tippet rings, but there are no rules in fly fishing. Remember that. That's just my personal preference. And I really think tippet rings, and the same reason I don't use these the triple surgeon's knot and tie tag end nymph rigs. I do all of mine as tandem nymph rigs because I just feel like they introduce a lot of opportunity for tangles. And if you're not a competent caster, it's really easy to just turn that into a bird's nest. So I don't use them for that reason. I didn't use them starting out because I wasn't a good caster starting out, and then I've never felt the need to move to them either in my fishing experience. Honestly, it feels like tippet rings are a solution in search of a problem that just doesn't exist, but that's my 2 cents. And if you fish with tippet rings and they work for you, that's fantastic. And I love that for you. And you are not a bad angler. You are not a bad person. You are not a bad anything. That's great. That's a great way that you can approach fishing and have that tool at your disposal. I think they're more work than they're worth. That's my 2 cents. But I highly encourage everybody to try it out because I did try them out before I made that opinion. I'm not just sitting here and pretending like I've used them. I have used them, and they're just not for me. So hopefully that goes over the pros and cons of the tippet rings. I definitely see why folks use them and like them, and I encourage you to give them a shot if you're on the fence about whether they'd be helpful for you. So thanks for the question. I really appreciate it. Parker from Colorado has our next question, writes in and says, "Hi, Spencer. I love the show and have learned so much from Ventures and your podcast. My question regards dry dropper rigs. I often struggle with fly selection on a dry dropper rig because, on one hand, I want high floating dries to hold up heavier nymphs down below, but I also want the delicacy of a smaller dry fly. I want to know your philosophy on selecting the pairing between dries and droppers. Would love to hear back from you. Thanks." Well, Parker, thank you. Appreciate the kind words about the show. It sounds like you're asking just a bit too much from your dry dropper rig, like you want it to do more than it's designed to do. Now, I'm going to explain that concept, but when I put my dry dropper rigs together, I want the whole thing to work as a system. They work in tandem with each other. That means my dry fly represents something that's readily available to the fish in that moment, and the same thing goes for my nymph. Okay, let me give you an example. On my favorite cutthroat stream here where I live, the fish are almost always happy to go for a caddis from like July to September. They'll eat caddis. So most of my dry dropper rigs, when I go to that river, have some sort of caddis on top, usually a size 14 or a size 16 elk hair caddis. And then my bottom nymph is almost always a Frenchie, a hare's ear, or a zebra midge, depending on what other bugs I see mixed in with that caddis hatch. Those nymphs are almost always the same size or a size smaller than my dry fly. And I do that because, again, I'm trying to match my rig to what's available to the fish in that moment. I certainly could throw a elk hair caddis and a stonefly dropper, but that stonefly is going to be too big for the caddis because, and this is how you know if your nymphs are sized up too big, because if your dry fly is getting constantly pulled underneath the water and it's constantly sinking, that means your nymph is too big. So I could do that, but I want my dry dropper rig to work in tandem because I want to present the dry fly to the fish as an opportunity to eat it, but I also want them to see the nymph as an opportunity as well. The dry fly also has to act as an indicator, so it's pulling double duty, but they need to work together. I'm not using the dry just as an indicator for my nymph, and that's really what I mean by working together. Now, one other example, one of my favorite freestone streams around here, there's a ton of stoneflies on this river. So when I'm over there, I fish stoneflies almost exclusively unless the drakes are coming off. Gets a pretty good drake hatch too. So my rig there, my dry dropper rig there is a big foam stonefly up top, usually a size 10 chubby Chernobyl. And then I'll throw a size 8 or a size 10 stonefly nymph as the dropper. You can go a little bit bigger when you're using foam flies because they'll float a lot of things. So you could even go one size up if you wanted to, just to target the really hungry fish or the really big stonefly nymphs. But again, the idea is that I am matching the flies in my dry dropper rig to the flies that are available to the fish. And then I'm matching my fly selection for what the conditions call for. Smaller, more delicate flies than what's the when that's the main table fare, that's what my dry dropper rig is going to be. So on that cutthroat stream, the caddis and the mayflies and the midges, that's the table fare. But on that bigger freestone, I'm going to be using larger flies because that's what the fish are eating. Now, as far as making sure that your nymphs get down deep enough, you mentioned that as well. You can solve that by using tungsten beads on your nymphs, tying a little bit of lead around the fly as well when you're tying the fly. And then I always tie my dropper. My dropper is very long. Usually they're at least 2 feet. Sometimes they're even longer because that allows the nymph to sink for quite a while before it actually starts pulling on the dry fly. So you can extend the drift there a little bit as well. So hopefully that clears it up, Parker. Thanks so much for sending your question in. Matt from California has our next question, writes in and says, brand new to fly fishing. Is it 100% necessary to add tippet to your fly line? And if so, how many feet of tippet do you tie to your fly line? Matt, this is a question I've been hearing a lot lately, actually, so thank you for sending it in. Let's define a few terms real quick, though, just so we're all on equal footing as we go through this. First off, we've got your fly line, which is that thick colored stuff that floats on top of the water that you cast with your fly rod. Then we attach leader to that. And all your leader is it's a tapered piece of nylon fishing line. Sometimes it can be fluorocarbon. They're often nylon, and they're often 9 feet long, and they go from thick at the butt end to thin at the tip. And they come in all sorts of sizes, usually sized to the 4X, 5X, 6X system that you see in fly fishing, where a 4X leader is bigger than 5X, which is bigger than 6X, and so on. And then you have your tippet. And these are spools of extra nylon line that are all just the same diameter. So it's like if you buy a spool of 8-pound test for your bait caster, I'm going to buy a spool of 4X or 5X or 6X for my fly rod. Now, the point of using tippet is to extend the life of your leader and to build multi-fly rigs. So if you are fishing throughout the day consistently and you're switching flies out, you'll notice at the end of your 5X leader is going to start to thicken up because you're chopping off that thin end of it. You can use tippet to tie some fresh 5X on, and then you've still got the right size of a leader that you need for your flies. And to figure out the right size of a leader or tippet that you need, you take the size of the fly that you're using and divide that by about 3. So a 16, for example, a size 16 dry fly, divide by 3 gets you about 5. So you'd want to use 5X tippet or leader for that fly. And then also if you've got a 3X leader, but you need 5X tippet because you want to go down and fish that size 16 dry fly, then you can tie on tippet to the end of that 3X leader to get you down to that size. And that's just one other way that we use tippet and leader. So hopefully that clears up those questions. If you've got any more, please let me know. Danny from Wyoming writes in and says, "Hey Spencer, it was nice seeing you in the fly shop last week. How did the new rod do? I enjoyed last week's podcast where you mainly shared stories. It was well put together. I'm currently trying to decide on what rods to purchase for client usage and was wondering on your thoughts of getting the Sage Foundation outfit versus the new Redington EDC paired with a Sage Spectrum C reel. If you were my client, which would you prefer and why? Our shop has many well-versed clients, and I want to be able to provide a quality experience with quality equipment. That being said, I'm not stuck on just those 2 rods. If you have another suggestion, they're just the front runners on my list of this year's rods." Hey, Danny, good to hear from you, man. The river fished okay that day, by the way. I caught like 1 fish, but at least I didn't get skunked. This was one of the few days it was actually warm enough to go out and fish. And I ran into Danny at the fly shop, and he's going to start guiding. I think he told me it was his first year this year. So congrats to Danny for getting into the guide game. Now, let's talk about your fly rods. I haven't fished the EDC from Redington yet, so I can't give you any thoughts on it. Generally, though, I think I'd prefer Sage rods from a guide's point of view because Sage rods tend to be just a little bit faster. And so they are more easily going to be able to throw your bigger nymph rigs from a boat, get distance on your hopper dropper rigs. And Sage is generally regarded as a higher end brand as well. So if you've got clients who know their way around fly fishing, that might be able to help you make a good first impression. But I think the real question that you've got to answer here is what sort of experience do you want your clients to have? I've fished in some places where the only rods they have for clients are Winston's or Thomas & Thomas or high-end Sage rods, and it felt very upscale. I felt like I needed to put on a dinner jacket. At some of those places, it felt really fancy and nice. But then I've also fished with a guide who had 25-year-old Sage XPs literally out together by tape, and we got tons of fish, so I didn't really care about the rods. And both situations were great, but they both created a different experience. Now, personally, on guide trips, I like to fish my own rods because I'm kind of picky, but your focus should be on what makes the best experience for the client. When I was guiding, I ran walk wade trips on mostly pretty small water. We went into the backcountry a lot, and that was a lot of fun. But my rods were much lighter, and they were slower action because that gave the client a better experience, a better feel with both the cast and with the fish, since the fish were a little smaller than what you're catching out of tailwaters. I picked a rod that I thought complemented the experience I was trying to get my clients to have. When you're guiding, especially where you're at, Nanny, a faster, stiffer rod that can handle those bigger nymph rigs, that might create a better experience for the client because it's going to be an easier cast. So even the ones who know their way around fly fishing, they'll still appreciate that they don't have to work the rod to get it to turn over the big nymph rig, for example. So I would build out your kit with that in mind. As a client, I'm not going to care what rod the guide has when I show up, so long as the guide gives me the opportunity to catch fish and then teaches me something. That's really the crux of it all. And I know some folks go on a guide trip because they've got this expectation to catch tons of fish, but that's unfair to the guide and to the fishery, to be honest, because not every fishery should be a place where you can put 30, 40 fish in the boat every single day. That's not good on the fish. It's not good for the long-term health of the fishery. And guides, in all honesty, should spend a majority of the time teaching and honing skills for the clients. Now, don't get me wrong. Catching fish is what you're there to do, and you want to catch plenty, but that shouldn't be the sole focus. When I go out on guide trips, I love asking guys to critique what I'm doing because I want to improve. And the guides know what they're doing, and they're literally watching me fish so they can give me real-time advice. Like, Durant, that was a bad cast, or wait a little longer on your back cast, or you call that a mend, right? They give me that feedback that's incredibly valuable and helpful for me to improve. And that's what I focused on when I was a guide. And the best guides I know are the ones who create that experience for their clients. So bottom line, pick gear that creates that experience you want your anglers to have, and then don't worry so much about the appearance of the gear itself. If they're all cheap rods, it doesn't really matter because clients want a clean boat, a happy guide, and a confident guide. You exude those things, you're going to be in business for a very long time. I appreciate the question, Danny. Thank you so much. And with that, folks, we're done with the Q&A section this week, but don't go anywhere because we've got the Live Real Life moment coming right up. Every week, we share a story from someone in the VFC audience who has been out there on the water living real life. We love to see the stories and pictures of you guys out there on the water enjoying yourselves. So if you've got a Live Real Life moment you would like to share, you can send that in at the link in the show notes. This week's Live Real Life moment is from Jason W. Writes in and says, straight out of episode 84, Small Stream Fishing. I live in North Georgia, where if you are willing to go up to our higher elevations and bushwhack through thick rhododendrons, you can find hidden gem streams with southern Appalachian brook trout. This stunning friend was caught on a self-tied size 14 Adams thanks to your fly tying masterclass. Thanks for all you guys do at VFC. I'm a teacher, fly fisherman, Diet Coke drinking, bearded guy who likes wings too, so Spencer and I should hang sometime. Jason, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. That's a beautiful little brookie. Good job. And congrats on doing it on a fly you tied yourself. That feels pretty good, doesn't it? That is a fun experience. I love those. I love those little brook trout streams. They can give you that good reset that you need if you got your butt kicked somewhere. You know, at least you can go catch a whole mess of little brookies one day and just have fun with it. So thanks for sending that in. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap the show up this week. Thank you so much for being here and listening to the whole thing. That really helps us out. And if you want to help us out even more, you can rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we can reach and help them live real life and have that fantastic time out on the water. And speaking of helping with that, we've got tons of links to other helpful content. Click on them wherever you see them. And until next week, everybody, get out on the water, enjoy yourself, and live real life.